I've always loved gaming as a medium. Video games can be a great educational tool in certain contexts. Games can help us process our sad feelings, explore different ideas, and oftentimes take inspiration from real life. The best games are the ones that blur the line between fiction and reality. In my last video, I broke down why I believe the story of Little Nightmares could be a child's understanding of the Holocaust. But today, I wanted to elaborate more on my previous theory. To do this, I want to talk about agency and accountability as concepts, and what the games do with these themes. Concepts like this are important to better understand how radicalization works. Also, I wanted to give a huge thanks to all of you who commented on my last Little Nightmares video. It was so much fun engaging with you all about different theories and general information. So let's break down the imagery in the Little Nightmares franchise and try to understand what it all means. If you missed my first video, I'd recommend checking this one out first. I go over my beginning theory and lay out a lot of the groundwork for this video. To give a brief recap, I said that Six was a Jewish girl and Mono was a German boy living during the Holocaust. The propaganda that Mono heard radicalized him so much that he became the Thin Man. He created the horrible world of Little Nightmares by creating propaganda, controlling everyone's mind under one prevailing thought. All of this imagery maps on pretty well onto the real-life events in the Holocaust, but everything I say in these videos is only a theory. I don't think Little Nightmares is actually a game about the Holocaust, only that there's a lot of Holocaust imagery in the games. I've been educating myself more on the universe of Little Nightmares, reading the comics, rewatching the gameplay, and consuming theories myself. This has given me more insight into the games. I hope in this video to craft a more cohesive theory for everyone. So let's dive a little deeper into this theory and see what lies in the depths. I'm Very Berry. If you enjoy this content, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. It helps a lot, and I'd really appreciate it. For a good theory to have its legs, it needs to have a foundational framework to operate on. I believe the Little Nightmares universe is caught in a time loop. I think the ending of the second game confirmed this when we see Mono turn into the Thin Man. We see a character go through time to become what he was running from. And the beginning of the game could be the start of another loop, going full circle if you will. Mono is perpetually stuck in this radicalization hellscape. But what does this time loop mean for the Little Nightmares universe? Well, a hell of a lot. For one thing, it could mean that there are an infinite amount of time loops and we are experiencing only a certain one. So Six from this game could turn out to be someone else in another time loop, or vice versa. One theory I've seen circulating is the idea that Six is the Geisha. So I've been putting together some evidence what it means for Six's character in my theory. How could a Jewish person run the Maw, a killing center in my theory? If Six was the Geisha, wouldn't this make the whole theory about her being Jewish fall apart? Well, my answer to this is not necessarily, but let's hold on to that for now, because first we need to break down agency in Little Nightmares. Agency is a philosophical idea about the capacity to act in a given circumstance. So for example, if you ate something today for lunch, did you choose to eat that thing? Did you want a sandwich regardless of the context of that day? Or did a Subway commercial subconsciously prompt you to want a sandwich? When we introspect on this level, it begins to blur the lines between how much freedom we really have. I think this concept is very important because discussions about agency help us understand the world around us. Are we making the choices we think we are? Or is someone else pulling our strings? Well, in the context of Little Nightmares, let's think about this for a moment. We aren't in control of anything in Little Nightmares. Everywhere we go seems planned out, and we have to do cruel things we don't want to progress the narrative. We can't not kill the gnome who we find out is the child in the DLC. This is what is known as the illusion of control, a concept that we sometimes think we had agency in situations where we didn't. This is a very similar experience to many Nazis and Germans radicalized by propaganda. They were aware of the cruelty, but it was justified to them because of the information fed to them. In hindsight, many felt regretful of their actions, but at the time the behavior became normalized to them. Their agency was stripped from them to some extent, because in a different context, the events might not play out the same. A person raised in an environment without propaganda wouldn't feel the same bigotry. This is similar to both Six and Mono in the game. Let's start out with Mono's character. Mono can tap into televisions to traverse the world of Little Nightmares. Or thought of another way, he identifies with the propaganda on screen and knows how to take advantage of it. One YouTuber talked about the idea of Mono running from the Thin Man. I love this theory because it maps on perfectly to what I was talking about previously. If multiple time loops are happening, then the Thin Man is actually the hero in the story to some extent. A Thin Man from a different universe could be trying to stop Mono from creating this hellscape. The important factor being that he can't do it. Mono believes he is in control of his future. If he defeats the Thin Man and saves his beloved friend, then at least they can fight the world together. But no matter how hard the Thin Man exerts his power, Mono's radicalization is already too far gone. Even his name can be thought of in this way. Mono means one. For example, a monolith of thought. The idea that there is only one acceptable thought, one eye, always watching to make sure the message spreads. Only one path forward, evidenced by the hallways and the general trajectory of the games. We as the player must do things we don't want to, in the same way that Mono didn't want to become radicalized. We believe we control the player and their choices, but we are ultimately passive, watching a preset sequence of events. If we apply this to a real-world context, this sentiment is very similar to the Holocaust. How much agency did people have during this time? If the TVs, the schools, and all the institutions have bigotry towards the Jewish people, what could someone do to escape this control? By having a unified thought, one idea to center reality around, it becomes easier to exert control over others. So now let's talk about Six and agency. If we assume Six is a Jewish girl, then wouldn't this theory fall apart? The Geisha runs the Maw, the worst death camp in the Little Nightmares universe. Well, my theory goes like this. Six is the only character in the game who has agency in Little Nightmares, but I believe that Geisha is Six in this universe. But another Six entered from a different time loop to change the course of events. There are so many ties between Six and the Geisha. Six is surrounded by broken mirror imagery, and she has an attachment to music boxes as a source of comfort, similar to the Geisha. Also, the wallpaper in the Dream Realm from the second game looks identical to the one in the ladies' quarters, which is the Geisha's domain. In the comics, we see Six fall into the Geisha's mask. The music box being crushed also looks similar to the Maw. Shout out to the Gaming Beaver for pointing a lot of this evidence out. Not to mention in the special ending, Six shows her next destination as the Maw. But why does she know the Maw, and what's a target? Well, what if Six from another universe made her way into this one to change the course of events? This would make sense with the Thin Man too. He could also be interfering with a different time loop. It seems like he could be trying to stop Mono, since the Thin Man doesn't seem like he has killing intent towards him. In the end of the Residence DLC, we see the Thin Man looking like he's going to come out of the screen. This scene could either be hype for the second game, or possibly a Thin Man entering this time loop. However, this still doesn't explain the Geisha of now. Well, maybe it does. If Six is Jewish in this theory, why would she run the Maw? But then I thought about a historical event that hadn't crossed my mind. During World War II, Nazis set up programs to weaken Jewish people's power as much as possible. They created camps in Nazi ghettos where they had Jewish people sell out their own. They called this organization Judenrats, or the Jewish Council. One council was established in Warsaw, and I can't help but notice the almost one-to-one resemblance of the school. This also makes sense with my previous theory. What if the Geisha from this universe was one of these members? It would make sense given the nature of her character. We know that Six was captured in the Hunter's house before Mono let her out, and we see similar scratch marks inside the school. So it can make sense that the school captured Six previously. Plus there are signs in the background that look like Six. What if this school disseminated propaganda and potentially created Judenrats or future Nazis? It's entirely possible that the torture or propaganda worked on this universe's version of Six. The Six we play as doesn't seem like she's over her torture though. Six enacts brutal violence towards her enemies and enjoys their demise. I believe this showcases how severe her abuse was. She still transfers it onto others to some extent. It's possible that the Geisha is cajoled into doing unspeakable evils, either by coercion or losing her agency from past torture. This was true for the Judenrats as well. Many were tortured or sent to labor camps after the Nazis used them. It especially makes sense when you think about how Mono seems to be controlling the world of Little Nightmares. He would know more than anyone how to coerce Six into doing his bidding. Judenrats had the responsibility of organizing death camps and reporting back to their Nazi leaders. There was a constant fear of death for the Judenrats, so they would do whatever they could to survive. So if we think of Six as the Geisha, she could be organizing this camp because Mono is forcing her. It makes sense why she would want to hide her face. Geishas also represent beauty, and they are found around the world in both games. So it's possible that as a child, Six had an obsession with these toys. If she felt disgusted by what she had done, it would make sense she would want to disguise herself as something beautiful. But before we talk about the main reason I think Six is the Geisha, we need to talk about the Maw. I've been thinking a lot about how the Maw resembles Auschwitz. If the Geisha was a Judenrat in charge of the Maw, then what do the people coming in to eat symbolize? Auschwitz was divided into 3 sections: an extermination, labor, and main camp. The Maw's structure is similar. The bottom of the ship seems to be where the executions take place. The middle portions are the main area of the ship, and the eating area is the labor camp. I think the guests in the Maw are coming in to fatten up, unknowingly being used by the Geisha. Their eating symbolizes the labor that Jewish people were forced to do. Jewish people were exploited during World War II extensively aggressively in terms of labor. They were taken onto trains and sent in to work for the Nazis or to be executed. They would work themselves to death because of exhaustion, dehydration, or malnutrition. In the case of Little Nightmares, I believe that the people in the Maw are forcing themselves to fatten up so that other characters can use their skin. Skin also being one of the many brutalities of the Holocaust. If you look at the characters engorging themselves, they don't seem happy and content. They seem almost zealous in their eating, almost compulsory if you will. Once they are no longer needed or their labor has been completed, then the Geisha executes them to preserve herself. It would make sense that the Geisha exploits them to ensure her own survival, her closest friend potentially using her weakness as leverage. If this scenario were the one happening in this universe, then this would tie back into agency and how the Geisha had her agency stripped from her by systems of control, Mono's control. Back on track now. The main reason I think 6 is the Geisha is because of the mirror imagery constantly around 6. Mirrors help to show us what we understand about ourselves. We can see our facial features, hair color, but mirrors can also be symbolic. Our reflection, who we see ourselves in the mirror. The ideas we have about ourselves greatly impact our perceptions of reality. If we did something good in the past, maybe we see a positive image of ourselves in the mirror. Or if we did something unspeakable, looking in the mirror can be soul-wrenchingly difficult. This can also be true about our behaviors. For the Geisha, if she were a Judenrat in this universe, it would make sense why mirrors are a kryptonite. She is partaking in a necessary evil given the circumstances of the world, cannibalizing her fellow people to survive. She sucks the soul out of others to keep herself alive, but the thought of this disgusts her so much that she can't look at herself in the mirror anymore. Exploiting people on the Maw, rounding them up to do labor, to work against their will until they are bursting at the seams. Mirrors are a reminder of the brutality that she commits. There are many Nazis and German citizens who felt this way shortly after the war. This feeling of being disgusted, but not having the means to do anything at the time. When all these systems of control were in place, having the means to enact change became almost impossible. This is where 6's character comes in. I think she is from another time loop, and is one of the only characters who can exert agency in this universe. Think about the enemies in Little Nightmares. Most of the time they are busying themselves with tasks, constantly working. The teacher is teaching, the doctor doctoring, the janitor is doing whatever janitors do. They seem to do only what they are capable of doing. Their tasks in this universe are set. So are the porcelain children. They are meant to capture and attack anyone who looks out of the norm. Similar to how German citizens were propagandized into reporting Jewish people to the Nazi government. Everyone in Little Nightmares has their role in the harm. 6 is the only one who seems to have the capacity to change. When 6 takes the antagonist's power, the logic of this world might dictate with the consumption of the enemy, she would continue down her path towards becoming the Geisha. Although she leaves the Maw, to me this might mean that her goal was to take the power of the Geisha to change the fate of the future, or it could be another step in the process. It's hard to say. The idea of agency also adds a lot of horror to the game. We are small characters compared to these menacing larger-than-life enemies. Hiding, running, and crawling from the inevitable. Fighting against the enemy is impossible. The only real means of survival is a chance that you don't get lost in the system. Then there are all the subtle examples of non-agency. The children are a good example. Without being explicitly instructed, they are mindless, not able to exert control over themselves. Or the constant puppet and mannequin imagery, giving us the player a feeling that someone else is pulling our strings to some extent. But agency isn't the only big theme in these games that relate to the Holocaust. Accountability was extremely difficult to gauge after the events of World War II. The courts had the impossible job of dictating how much of what the Nazis did was of their own volition. Many used hierarchy as a means to justify their behaviors, which was true to some extent. Many Nazis did act purely out of fear of repercussions. But with the systems of control in place, accountability becomes muddied. A group constructed a study called the Milgram experiment to test how people might act in this situation. How far will someone go if instructed? So they set up a test to prove this hypothesis. They have a room with a participant and an instructor. The instructor tells the participant to shock someone in another room by pressing a button. Unbeknownst to them, it's just a recording. So when the instructor tells the person to press the button, they can either press it or not. They aren't forced to push the button though, only encouraged. The shocks get increasingly higher, so each time the recording reacts more violently. Eventually, the recording begs not to be shocked, or they could be severely hurt. What the experiment found out is that most people ended up shocking to the highest percentile. This study illuminates so much about the human condition in my opinion. It's oftentimes easier to blame someone else in a stressful scenario than analyze our own behaviors. We went over how this happened in the case of the Nazis, but what about in Little Nightmares? I think accountability is especially apparent in this franchise. Almost all the enemies in the game either hide their face or wear skin masks of someone else. I think this symbolizes the lack of accountability that the characters believe they have in this situation. Putting on a mask can have several meanings. They can be literal, like putting on an item to change our appearance, or more figuratively, where we are masking tenets of ourselves by emulating others' behaviors. If the teacher or chefs weren't embarrassed or disgusted by their behaviors, it doesn't seem like they'd have an incentive to hide their faces. There is lots of human skin in the Little Nightmares universe, and most of the skin is shown in the form of human faces, similar to the faces of the guests at the Maw. It seems like the Doctor is the one who does the majority of the experimentation in Little Nightmares, so it would make sense that he might be the one creating the faces for the other characters. But what if this was all part of Mono's plan? Think about it in terms of the Holocaust for a second. If you were the leader of the party, the best type of Nazi would be the one who doesn't think they are accountable for their actions. A person who hides behind a mask, doing the cruel, unspeakable evils no one else will. A Nazi who performs as a teacher. A Nazi who emulates the behaviors of a chef. These types of people who can infiltrate normal life by wearing the masks of others, giving themselves layers of removal from the situation, even though they are directly responsible. If they are wearing the skin of the guests in the Maw, it also adds to the idea of hiding one's identity by exploiting someone else. It makes sense that the other characters in the game have the same problem as the Geisha as well. As they operate in this oppressive system of control, they question their role in it all. Seeing the horrible things they have done necessitates a mask, to not engage with who they were before their radicalization. But the pernicious thing about propaganda is that it can work on a teacher, or a chef, or an everyday person. On the surface, you see a teacher, but upon closer examination, a face devoid of feeling, cold eyes always watching, no introspection left to be had. The classroom is a perfect example to explain what I mean. This classroom looks normal when you enter it. The students seem a little fearful, but students can look anxious during a test. Everything is performatively the same as the classroom, but we all know what happens when the teacher turns around. The whole facade falls apart. The mask of the classroom is no more. What seemed like an institution of learning ended up being a propaganda outlet. We can see the power of propaganda the most with the porcelain children. They can't function without instruction and attack mindlessly who they view to be the enemies. But the propaganda is so pervasive and destructive, especially to the impressionable, so much so that the children's heads are empty. They don't engage with ideas of accountability because they are extension of the scariest outcome of propaganda, the normalization of radicalization. This was very similar to the Nazi Party. Their bigotry was so normalized that they felt proud to be members of a horrible organization, stripping themselves of accountability, hiding behind a shared racist ideology. But the most important mask wearing has to be the main characters. I think they enjoy the same level of removal as the enemies in the game. Six and Mono both hide their faces just like the enemies. Throughout the games, the two do some pretty heinous things. The one thing I find interesting though is how after Mono identifies with enough propaganda, he eventually goes mask off. This stays consistent with this character too. The Thin Man's face, although obfuscated by shadows, is clearly visible. If we think about this in terms of accountability in the Holocaust, to me this would signify the Thin Man feels comfortable enough in the world to have accountability for his actions. Instead of hiding his face with a bag, he wanted to be out in the open with his bigotry, taking accountability for his actions in an unhealthy way. Instead of being repentant for the world of Little Nightmares, taking pride in the demise of others. So here's my new expanded theory so far. Six is a Jewish girl and Mono is a German boy living during the Holocaust. The Six that we play as came in from another time loop because she is the only one to exert any level of agency over the world. In the world of Little Nightmares, nothing can be avoided, even fate itself. Six and Mono traverse the institutions of power to understand the world around them. In the process, Mono became radicalized by the propaganda present during the Holocaust. A Mono from another dimension breaks his way into this world, trying to stop the inevitable. He tries to take Six from Mono to break the cycle, but his path has already been laid out. One way to move forward, one ideology to cling to. Mono then created the world of Little Nightmares. This demented world uses schools, televisions, and the government to exert control at large. All of this orchestrated by one man. He creates the perfect environment for hate and bigotry, burning books to control the narrative, teaching hate in the schools, and helping create masks at the behest of others. The environment allows the enemies in Little Nightmares to do what they do, free from constraints. Little to no agency, because the propaganda and misinformation led them down a certain constructed path. Everyone wears masks to hide themselves and take accountability away from their actions. This infrastructure causes discrimination against the Jewish people. Six marks herself with her iconic coat that she found with her closest friend. She enters the Maw to undo what's been done in this universe. Afraid of the journey, but more so afraid of herself. Unable to look at herself from her past atrocities, she knows her enemy's weakness. She finally shows the villain behind the mask the extent to what they've done. A labor camp ran by a radicalized version of herself, exploiting people's labor to help create the sick and twisted world. Six defeats this version of herself, but instead of using the power to perpetuate hate like the others in the game, the Six from this time loop chooses to walk away. to end the cycle of hate and unaccountability. If she is a Jewish person in this universe, she knows more than anyone the suffering of torture and cruelty. Breaking the cycle would give a lot of meaning to the outro sequence as well. Holding onto the jacket is a memory of the past. To never forget the power of radicalization and the impact it had on her close friend. Seeing the outcomes of perpetuation of hateful ideas, 6 breaks the mold. She opened the doors up and chose her own path. Or maybe continue down the road to becoming the geisha in an Inception level time loop. But who knows? And again, this is only a theory. I think Little Nightmares and other games with cryptic stories are perfect ways for us to engage in creative thinking. This game has a lot to say about the power of systems of control and the outcomes of propaganda. Not everyone learns the same, and games can be a great learning tool for some people. When I was in class, I'd want to smash my head against the desk sometimes out of boredom. But when I am thrown into an enrapturing game world, suddenly I remember every perk, stat, and canonical history of the game. I hope in the future that more companies will take inspiration from games like these to create interactive forms of education for newer generations. I know I'd be on board. Thanks so much for watching another one of my Little Nightmares videos. Let me know down in the comments your thoughts or theories about Little Nightmares. These theories have been my addiction recently, and I love to see what everyone comes up with or evidence that I missed. Also, let me know if you'd like me to cover similar games like Inside. Thanks, have a good one.